A small girl, her innocent eyes filled with emotion, stands in front of a wealthy man and asks a question that shakes him to his core. "Why did you leave my mommy?" In the heart of the city, surrounded by luxurious cars and towering mansions, stands a man named Richard Grant. A self-made millionaire, Richard is the kind of person who seems to have everything: power, money, and a grand estate. Yet, beneath his calm exterior lies a deep loneliness that he has learned to live with. Ever since his painful divorce several years ago, Richard has thrown himself into his work, leaving behind the family he once cherished. His mansion feels like a cold, empty shell, a reminder of the love that was lost. Despite his wealth, he finds no joy in the grandeur that surrounds him. Meanwhile, across town, a woman named Sarah Miller struggles to make ends meet. She's a single mother, juggling 2 jobs and doing everything in her power to provide for her young daughter, Lily. Sarah is the kind of woman who smiles through her hardships, hiding her exhaustion behind her warm embrace for Lily. She knows what it's like to feel invisible, but she would do anything for her daughter. When an unexpected opportunity arises for Sarah to work as a housekeeper in Richard's mansion, she hesitates. The job promises stability, something she desperately needs. It would take her out of the daily grind and into a new world, one filled with wealth and privilege, but also one she doesn't feel she belongs in. Sarah's heart tells her it's a chance worth taking for Lily's future. The first day Sarah steps into Richard's mansion, the stark contrast between her world and his is impossible to ignore. The house is grand, almost intimidating in its opulence. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and high ceilings that seem to echo her every step. As she walks through the grand halls, she feels out of place, like a fish out of water in a world of silk and gold. Her worn shoes click against the polished floors as she nervously adjusts her uniform. Richard, who spends most of his time in his study or traveling for business, rarely ventures out into the house. His presence feels like an afterthought in the mansion. On the rare occasion that they cross paths, he offers a polite nod but nothing more. He is a man who has become a stranger to connection, wrapped up in his past mistakes and his current solitude. He keeps his distance, his cold demeanor making Sarah feel like an outsider. Yet, as the days pass, Sarah's resilience and determination shine through. She may not fit in with the world of wealth and privilege around her, but she finds strength in her love for Lily. For her daughter's sake, she'll face the challenges of this new life head-on, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. As Sarah becomes more accustomed to her duties in the mansion, she begins to notice things that stir her curiosity. The house feels like a living monument to Richard's achievements, but it's also a symbol of what's been lost. The emptiness is palpable, and Sarah can't help but wonder what happened to the man behind the wealth and the grand estate. Late one evening, while cleaning Richard's study, she stumbles upon a photograph tucked away in a drawer. The image shows Richard as a younger man, smiling beside a woman and a child. It's a stark contrast to the lonely figure Sarah has come to know. The child in the picture catches her eye. The boy's likeness to Lily is uncanny. For a moment, Sarah wonders if the photo might be a relic of Richard's past life, a life that once included a family, a life he's since left behind. The photograph feels like a key to a long-forgotten story, and Sarah can't shake the feeling that there's something more beneath the surface of Richard's cold exterior. The more Sarah works in the mansion, the more she becomes intrigued by Richard's distant, almost sorrowful nature. It's as if he's constantly haunted by the shadows of his past. And though they don't speak much, there's an unspoken understanding between them, one that Sarah can't ignore. As days turn into weeks, the lives of Sarah and Richard begin to intersect in ways neither of them expected. Sarah's daughter, Lily, who is now old enough to understand the dynamics of her world, starts spending more time at the mansion. As much as Sarah tries to shield her from the complexities of life, Lily's curiosity always seems to bring her into Richard's orbit. The two have crossed paths before, but it's on one fateful afternoon that Lily, with her innocent boldness, speaks words that will change everything. Lily, who has noticed Richard's frequent somber mood, looks at him with wide, searching eyes. "Why did you leave my mommy?" she asks, her small voice carrying the weight of a question that only the truth can answer. Richard is stunned. The question lingers in the air, thick with emotion, and for the first time in years, Richard feels a pang of guilt, a reminder of the life he once shared with Sarah. This moment, though brief, has a profound impact on Richard. It's as if the walls he has built around himself begin to crumble. Sarah, who has spent so much of her life surviving, begins to question her own choices. What happens when two people once so far apart are brought together by the unlikeliest of circumstances? Sarah couldn't shake the memory of Lily's question. That simple, innocent inquiry had reverberated through her heart, and despite the years of hardship she had endured, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of frustration and sympathy for Richard. She'd always known there was more to his story. His past seemed too perfectly hidden behind his wealth and the imposing walls of his mansion. The question lingered, hanging between them, unspoken but ever present. Richard, on the other hand, found himself wrestling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. He had buried his past so deeply, attempting to forget the family he once cherished. But Lily's words reopened old wounds. The cold, composed businessman he had become had been built on avoiding feelings, avoiding love even. Yet there was something about Sarah's resilience, her quiet strength, and now her daughter's innocence, that tugged at him. For days, Richard watched Sarah from afar, noting the care she took in everything she did, from cleaning to managing her life outside of the mansion. He noticed how her daughter's presence lit up the otherwise gloomy house. A part of him, buried under the layers of his unresolved past, began to yearn for the connection he'd long suppressed. In the meantime, Sarah's thoughts began to wander back to the photograph she had found in Richard's study. She couldn't ignore the striking resemblance between the boy in the photo and her own daughter. It was more than just coincidence. It felt like fate. She spent nights replaying that moment in her mind, wondering if the photograph was the key to unlocking the mystery of Richard's past. Had he once had a family? And if so, what had happened to them? What made him turn his back on everything that once mattered? Driven by her desire to understand, Sarah found herself slowly creeping deeper into the mansion's past, learning more about the man she worked for, despite the boundaries that seemed to exist between them. She discovered that Richard had once been married to a woman named Claire. However, the marriage had ended in tragedy. Claire had died in a car accident years ago, leaving Richard devastated. What troubled Sarah, though, was the fact that no one had mentioned a child, just a quiet acknowledgement of Richard's loss. One afternoon, she stumbled upon Richard, sitting alone by the grand piano. The weight of his grief was evident in the way his fingers lightly grazed the keys, as if music could ease his aching heart. Sarah approached him cautiously, unsure of whether it was the right time to speak. But something inside her told her that the moment for honesty had arrived. The mansion had been Richard's refuge, a place where he could escape the painful memories of the past. But as Sarah and Lily's presence in his life deepened, so too did his longing for something he had buried long ago: connection. One evening, as Sarah worked in the kitchen, Lily wandered into the grand living room, her curiosity leading her to explore corners of the house that were usually untouched. Richard had been in his study, but when he heard the soft giggles of the child echoing through the halls, he found himself intrigued. Lily had been drawn to the old family portraits that lined the walls. She had no way of knowing the significance of these images, of the young couple smiling in their wedding photos, or the man in the military uniform who was never spoken of. She paused in front of one particular portrait, a photo of Richard with his late wife, Claire. Her innocent voice broke the silence. "Mommy said you lost someone you loved," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is your wife, isn't it? She's pretty." Richard's chest tightened as the flood of memories overtook him. He forced a smile, but his heart ached, and he didn't know if he was ready to face those memories again. The next morning, Richard found himself on the balcony, watching as Sarah and Lily played in the garden. The simplicity of their bond, the way Lily ran and laughed with abandon, was something he had not experienced in years. It made him feel as though he had been living in a bubble of self-imposed isolation, never allowing himself the joy of such uncomplicated love. As Sarah moved about tending to the plants, Richard approached her, his steps hesitant. It wasn't like him to initiate conversation, especially about something as personal as the past. But there was something in Sarah's eyes, something that told him she might understand, or at least help him make sense of the pain he carried. "Sarah," he began quietly, "I've been meaning to ask about you. How did you get here? How did you end up in this life?" He didn't expect her to answer, but he needed to know, needed to understand what made her so strong in the face of adversity, what drove her to press on despite the difficult circumstances that life had dealt her. The sincerity in his voice surprised her, and for the first time since she'd started working at the mansion, Sarah felt as though Richard was opening up, letting down the walls he had so carefully constructed. For the first time, she felt like they might share something real. It was a rainy afternoon when the turning point came. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing a meal for Lily, who was quietly playing with her toys nearby. Richard, having spent much of the day buried in work, was in his study, struggling to keep his emotions in check. As Sarah moved through the house, she found herself drawn to the living room, where she overheard Richard and Lily talking softly. "Did you ever tell Mommy about your wife?" Lily's innocent voice echoed through the room, her words like daggers aimed at the walls Richard had so carefully built around his heart. For a long moment there was silence, and then Richard spoke. "No, sweetheart, I never did. But sometimes the things we lose, they stay with us forever. I wasn't ready to talk about it, but maybe I am now." Sarah's heart twisted with empathy. She had no idea how much Richard had been carrying, how deeply the loss of his wife still affected him. It became clear to her that he had been so focused on surviving his pain that he had neglected to truly live. But here, in front of her, he was starting to confront his grief. As Richard opened up to Sarah, something changed in the air. The weight of his unspoken emotions hung between them, and Sarah finally saw the man beneath the wealth and the walls. He was fragile, vulnerable, and lost in his own way, just as she had been when she first came to the mansion. They shared a bond of shared grief, a silent understanding that neither had ever expected to find. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the garden. Sarah rushed to the window, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Lily lying on the ground, her tiny body unmoving. Richard was already at the door, his panic evident as he rushed outside to help. Sarah followed, breathless and terrified. Lily had tripped and fallen while playing in the rain, her tiny body injured from the fall. Richard knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he checked for any signs of serious injury. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped, and everything in Richard's world shifted. Lily's frightened face softened as Richard gently held her hand, and in that moment, Richard realized that he could no longer live in isolation, locked away from the world and from his emotions. Richard carefully lifted Lily in his arms, his thoughts racing. His mind was flooded with memories of his late wife, how she had always been the one to calm him down, to tell him everything would be okay. He had forgotten what it felt like to open up to someone, to let go of the pain. But with Lily's delicate hand wrapped around his finger and Sarah by his side, something clicked within him. As they rushed inside to tend to Lily's scraped knees, Sarah noticed how gently Richard was handling the situation. His once cold exterior had cracked, and it was clear that his heart was no longer frozen in the past. Lily, sensing Richard's newfound vulnerability, clung to him, comforted by his embrace. Sarah could barely hold back her tears as she watched the scene unfold before her. For the first time, Richard wasn't the distant, wealthy businessman. He was just a man who had experienced profound loss and was finally learning to live again. Lily's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts, asking, "Why did you leave my mommy, Mr. Richard?" Her innocence hung in the air, a painful reminder of the years that had passed without an explanation. The question lingered, and Sarah knew this moment was the key to everything. The question hit Richard like a wave, sweeping him into a sea of guilt. He looked down at Lily, who was clinging to him with wide, trusting eyes, waiting for an answer. The little girl's question, so simple yet so profound, cracked the final piece of armor Richard had been holding on to for so long. Richard swallowed hard, his voice catching in his throat. He had spent years burying the truth, pretending that his past no longer mattered, but here was this innocent child demanding the truth. He could no longer deny it, not to himself, not to Lily, and certainly not to Sarah. He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to Sarah, who stood there, silently urging him to speak. Richard finally whispered, "I didn't leave her on purpose, Lily. I was afraid of not being enough. I couldn't live with the memory of her, and I convinced myself that it was easier to run away." He paused, his eyes filled with regret. "But I was wrong. I should have fought for her. I should have fought for all of us." The weight of his words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She could see the shame in Richard's eyes, but also the release, as though he had let go of years of repressed guilt. The room was still, the tension thick with unspoken emotions. Richard's admission hung in the air, a heavy weight that neither he nor Sarah knew how to handle. Lily, who had been waiting for more, looked up at Richard, her small face softening as she sensed his regret. She didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but she knew the pain in his eyes wasn't something to be taken lightly. For a moment there was complete silence. Then Lily, in her innocent wisdom, asked the one question that would forever change the course of their lives. "Can we still be a family?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The question was simple, yet it held the power to heal the wounds that had been festering for so long. Richard's heart swelled at the thought. Could they? Could he truly make up for all the time lost, all the years of neglect? Richard, his voice barely above a whisper, nodded. "Yes, Lily. I hope so." Sarah watched, a mixture of hope and doubt in her eyes. The man she had once loved, the man who had hurt her so deeply, was standing in front of her now, vulnerable and broken. But there was something in his gaze that made her wonder if it was finally time for them to try again. As Richard held Lily, his thoughts continued to race. He had always kept a wall up, convinced that being emotionally distant was the best way to protect himself from further heartbreak. But with Lily's question, he realized that the wall he had built to shield himself had also kept him from living, from truly connecting with the people who mattered most. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the present, about the possibility of rebuilding the future. The love that he had once shared with Sarah, the love that had been lost in the fog of time, could it really be revived? Was it possible to forgive, to start fresh, despite the pain? As he looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the soft light filtering through the window, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Hope. It was fragile, like a delicate flower pushing through cracked concrete. But it was there. Richard knew that in this moment, he had the chance to change everything. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice stronger now. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you, both of you." Days passed, and Richard's actions began to speak louder than his words ever could. He started showing up for Lily, not just as her protector, but as her father figure. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. He would take her to the park, play games, and share stories about his own childhood, a time when he too had known love and joy before it all slipped away. But the real change was with Sarah. Richard didn't just apologize to her, he worked tirelessly to prove his commitment. He helped her with the house, made decisions together, and took care of things that had once been hers alone. Slowly, Sarah began to let her guard down, to trust again. She could see the transformation in him, not just the guilt and regret, but the genuine desire to make things right. It wasn't easy, and there were days when doubts crept in. But Sarah knew deep down that Richard was trying. He was finally doing what he had once failed to do, being present, being a partner, a father. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed full of promise, not just for Sarah and Lily, but for Richard as well. Sarah's heart began to soften, and with each passing moment, the walls she had built around herself started to crumble. She wasn't sure if forgiveness was something that could be achieved overnight, but she was learning that healing didn't always follow a straight path. Richard's dedication to rebuilding their family didn't go unnoticed. He had turned into the man she had once hoped he would be. No longer just a wealthy businessman obsessed with his success, he was becoming a loving, present father to Lily, a companion to Sarah. He was no longer running away from the past. Instead, he was embracing it, acknowledging his mistakes, and doing everything he could to atone for them. As Sarah and Richard spent more time together, their conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. They laughed together, shared their dreams, and even argued at times, but it was all a part of the process of rebuilding what had been broken. One evening, as they sat together with Lily, enjoying a quiet moment, Richard turned to Sarah. "I don't know if I deserve another chance, but I'll spend every day trying to prove I'm worth it." Sarah, her heart full, smiled softly. "We're all learning, Richard. We'll take it one step at a time." Months had passed since that pivotal moment, and the changes in Richard and Sarah's lives were undeniable. They had built a life together, a new foundation where trust, love, and understanding flourished. The house that had once felt like a cold, empty mansion was now filled with warmth and laughter. Sarah and Richard, with Lily by their side, had found a new rhythm, a family bound not just by blood, but by the shared experience of healing and growth. Richard had kept his promise to Sarah. He didn't just apologize, he acted. He spent his days supporting their home, contributing in ways he never had before. And while it wasn't always easy, both of them found solace in the slow but steady process of rebuilding. For Sarah, it was a journey of rediscovery. She had rediscovered not just her love for Richard, but also her belief in second chances. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning from it and moving forward with hope. There were moments of uncertainty, of course, but together they faced them, stronger as a couple and as a family. And for Lily, it was the joy of seeing her parents find each other again, to witness the love between them grow in ways that felt like a dream come true. The once distant and emotionally unavailable Richard had transformed into a man who cherished every moment with his family. He took pride in his role as a father to Lily, spending time teaching her new things, playing games, and supporting her ambitions. Their bond had deepened in ways that he could never have imagined before. Richard's guilt about the past was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned to embrace the present, to cherish the moments he had with his family. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table together, Richard looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. "You gave me a second chance, and I'll never take it for granted." Sarah, her heart full, reached across the table and took his hand. "We gave each other a second chance," she said, smiling warmly, "and we're still learning." It was in that moment, surrounded by the simple joy of family, that Richard realized he had found something greater than wealth, something more valuable than all the success in the world, a deep, abiding love. The following week saw Richard, Sarah, and Lily becoming even more inseparable. They began to travel together, exploring new places and creating memories that would last a lifetime. They visited the beach, went hiking, and even took a trip to the mountains, a place Richard had once deemed too far away, too time-consuming. But now, it was a destination full of meaning, a place to reflect and bond. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet forest trail, Sarah stopped and looked at Richard, her eyes filled with a quiet kind of contentment. "I never thought we'd get here," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "But we did. Together." Richard smiled, taking her hand. "I didn't think I deserved this, but I'm grateful every day that I get to be here with you." Lily, who had been running ahead, stopped and turned around with a mischievous grin. "Mom, "Dad, come on. You're too slow," she called, her laughter echoing through the trees. They laughed together, the sound of their joy filling the air. It was in moments like this that Richard realized the true meaning of family. It wasn't about the perfect picture, the perfect life. It was about the messy, imperfect, beautiful journey they were on together. Months later, the family stood in front of their new home, a cozy house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, a symbol of their fresh start, of the hard work and healing that had led them to this moment. The keys to the house had been a gift from Richard, but it was a gift that Sarah had accepted not just out of necessity, but with love. This house, this life they were building, wasn't about material wealth. It was about the bond they shared. As they moved in, Richard couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The once cold and distant man who had walked away from everything had found redemption in the most unexpected place, within his family. They had taught him the most important lesson of all, that love was not just something to receive, but something to give. On the porch, Sarah stood beside him, watching as Lily ran around, excited about the new chapter of their lives. Richard wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. Sarah smiled, leaning into him. "The beginning of everything."